Hello everyone. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Brianne and I am one of the youth workers here at St John's, and I lead worship sometimes and on the odd occasion preach, but that's not all that often. So please bear that in mind before you judge whatever I say today. I also, the question I was given today, Andy already read out the verse from Luke. The question I was given was, how do we live as disciples? So I suppose a disclaimer would be that this is my own opinion on that, or like my own thought on that for what I felt when I read this verse and what I thought about. So there will be other people here who have a different idea, different thoughts. This is just my own thoughts on that. So when looking at this question with this story in Luke, I thought that the best way to answer it would be to split it into two sections. So the first section is going to be about following Jesus, and the second section is going to be about evangelism. So in following Jesus, Luke 5:11 says they left everything and followed him. So I thought, what does that mean? And then I was looking up Bible verses, thinking, is there any other parts that talk about following Jesus? And funnily enough, considering the question, Luke 14:27 says, whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. So this is specifically saying that to be a disciple, to live as a disciple, you have to follow Jesus. So that was really helpful for me trying to answer this question. But then I thought, well, what does following Jesus mean? And overall, I would say that it could be summarized in three things. Number one would be faith, living in faith, having a belief in Jesus and what he achieved, his death and resurrection. Obedience, so to Jesus' teaching and cultivating the fruit of the Spirit and serving others and generally obeying how Jesus lived his life. And then transformation, in the sense of repentance and forgiveness. But if you put following Jesus into those three things and just explain it like that, that makes it sound really simple. And I could just walk away right now and be like, that's how you do it, folks. But actually, we all know, realistically, it's not that easy. It's not simple. It's hard. And if anybody is anything like me, you hold yourself to completely impossible standards and then get upset because you can't meet them. Because realistically, we can't be Jesus. We can't actually be Jesus because he was divine, is divine. And we're not. But we can follow his blueprint the best we can. We have 4 Gospels, 4 canon accounts of his life where we can see how he lived it, how he lived and how he went about his life. So we can look at that. We can pray. We can cultivate our own personal relationships with the Father like Jesus did, so that we might grow and change with him involved in that. This is highlighted well in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus tells you not what to believe, but tells you how to be and operate in the world. And it's interesting that 300 years after that, at the Council of Nicaea, faith had been distilled into being obedient in thought, but not how you act. And the creeds tell you what to believe, but Jesus, in his most important sermon, didn't tell us what to believe, but told us how to be. So I thought that was really interesting. Thinking about following Jesus and how to be. And different people will have different priorities or journeys, but I feel like in that, one of the most important things to pray for is compassion and love for other people. There's so much disagreement around what the obedience section of that would be, because nobody can agree on what Jesus actually taught or what he meant by what he said. And there's also loads of things that he didn't talk about, that he didn't mention. And then we often like as Christians, can become very legalistic about his teaching and then place our own beliefs onto other people's lives. And when we do that, we alienate individuals or even entire groups of people. We quite often expect non-Christians to behave like Christians. And why would they? That just doesn't make sense. And even then, what does that even mean? Behave like a Christian, because everybody's got a different opinion of that. So even the non-Christians that are expected to behave like Christians we don't even know what they're meant to be doing. So yeah, it doesn't make sense. Why would we do that? But I think something that we can all agree on as Christians is that God is love. And one of Jesus' biggest qualities when you read his story is how he loved those around him. So I think if you pray for love and compassion for others, so much good stems from it. When what you do or how you operate comes from a place of love instead of some sort of legalism, I think that's when you most look like Jesus, when you best represent him. And that, to me, is what I would say is following Jesus. But that also leads me on to my next part, which is on evangelism. So in Luke 5:10, it says, "From now on you will be catching people," the whole sort of famous fishers for men verse. So what does that mean? Is it talking about evangelism? And if it is talking about evangelism, what does that involve? Because when I think about that, the thought of actively going out to spread the gospel fills me with such dread. And that is just not something I want to be doing. It's not me. I find it really cringy. No. So is that what this means? Is it telling me that I have to go out and do that? Or are there other ways to catch people? And when I was thinking about this, the first thing that came into my head was a section from Mark. I'm going to read the whole bit out, but I'll just put the important bits on the slide. It's from Mark 6:30 to 37. So yeah, I'll read the whole bit out, but the important bits are on the slide. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure to even eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore and saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." So two things come to mind when I was looking at that story. The first one is that they were tired, they hadn't eaten, and twice they could have just left the people, but they didn't because Jesus had compassion on them and cared for them. And this goes on to the feeding of the 5,000, so he then fed them. The second thing is that the crowds in this story actually wanted to hear what Jesus had to say. It wasn't Jesus and his disciples chasing people and trying to give them the word. It was the people asking and wanting to know. For me, those two things really encompass what evangelizing and being a disciple of Jesus is all about. Caring for people, having compassion for people, and displaying the love of God in that way. And speaking the gospel to people who actually want to hear it. St. Francis of Assisi famously said, "Preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words." And I love that. I feel like that is how I live my evangelistic life, because I don't want to just start talking about Jesus every 5 seconds to everybody I meet and desperately try and tell them about him. I want to feel like I can preach the gospel some way by just living my life. I like that quote a lot. When I was going through this sermon with Andy, because I'm too scared to just write a sermon by myself, I asked Andy to read through it for me, and he said that I should tell a specific story in relation to this. So apologies to any youth in the room, because you probably have heard it. I am a story repeater. And anybody generally, my pals will all have heard this story. Loads of people will know it already. But just in case you don't, I don't even know what age I was. I would have been like my early 20s. And I was on a night out in the Dreadnought in Bathgate. And at the time, loads of my friends used to volunteer with the street pastors. If you don't know what the street pastors are, they're a group of Christians from different churches in Bathgate that all go out sort of once a month on a Saturday night, and they stay out until like 4 o'clock in the morning and look after drunk people that are walking about the streets and make sure they can get home or whatever. And if they get the chance to talk about the gospel, that's great, but it's more about caring for the people who are about. They have like flip-flops that they give out to girls who are struggling to walk in their heels because they're too drunk and stuff like that. They're good. So I used to know a lot of people who volunteered with the street pastors. So if I went on a night out, I would swing by the street pastors to say hi first before I walked home. So on this night out, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I decided to swing by the street pastors on my way home and go and visit them. So I did that, and I was chatting away to one of my friends, but then he ended up dealing with some drunk people. And while we were there, there was a guy who, I'm just going to have to say Lewis, you were there because it's easier for me to tell this story by saying that you were there. Lewis was the street pastor. He went off to go and help someone, but while we were there, someone that he had gone to school with had come out of a club very drunk, and recognised them, so he'd come over to talk to us, and then Lewis had left to go and deal with these people. So I ended up just talking to this guy, and we were just talking like nothing particularly deep, and then it sort of went eventually to who the street pastors were, that they were Christians, that they were from churches, and he was telling me all about his strong belief in atheism and all that sort of stuff. We ended up chatting away for a good couple of hours in the middle of the night in the middle of the street in Bathgate, and then we like added each other on Facebook because it turned out we had like a bunch of mutual friends and we'd been invited to the same party the following weekend, and that was that. Then we went to that same party and like the following weekend, and again there was not really much chat. He was much quieter that time because he was sober. And eventually, over the course of like 4 years, this guy would message me on the odd occasion with a random question about faith. I didn't really know him. I never met him after that point for years. And he would occasionally say to me, I was just wondering about this thing, or eventually he was like, there's a girl at my work that I really fancy and she's a Christian, and then he would like talk to me about like her, and then he'd be trying to understand her faith because it was important to her and he fancied her, so he would try and understand it, and he would be asking me questions. And eventually he went on an alpha course, so then every time he had been to this alpha course he was messaging me and asking questions. And then eventually I got a text from him about 4 or 5 years in. Again, I'd only met this boy twice, and one of those times was at 3 o'clock in the morning in the high street in Bathgate. And he said, I just got baptised. And I was like, that's really cool, that's brilliant, like, congratulations, blah, blah, blah. So he had become a Christian. And then about a year after that, I got a message from him that was an invite to his wedding. And he was like, if you're free next weekend, I'm getting married. Do you want to come? And I was like, tell me it is to that girl at your work that you fancied. And it was, which was pretty cool. So I went to his wedding. So his wedding day was the third time I ever met him. And then I met his wife, and I was like, hey, and all these people were like, how do you know him? And I had to be like, But eventually I met his wife, and I was like, hey, you probably don't even know who I am, but congratulations, blah, blah. And she was like, of course I know who you are. She was like, I wouldn't have gotten married today if it wasn't for you. So that's a pretty dramatic story to illustrate a point, and it's not always going to be like that. But it made me think, so in that situation, I wasn't even a street pastor. I literally was on a night out. I was not there to be a street pastor. I hadn't gone out with the intention to preach the gospel to anybody. I answered questions when he asked, rather than bombarding him with messages about the good news. And I got to watch God's plan for somebody's life play out from the sidelines. I was barely there. I have genuinely, still to this day, have only met this man 3 times. And the 3rd time was on his wedding day. I think people forget a lot of the time that it's not them who are converting people, it's God. God has to be a part of it and do something. Otherwise, you're in danger of coming across like you're criticising people for how they live their lives, and the only reason that you can back yourself up with is that some magical, mystical being told you so and didn't bother to tell that person for themselves. And that's one of the reasons why many, like Christians generally, end up with such a reputation for being judgmental. There was, like, that incident, it wasn't just me. I didn't convert that person. I wasn't even there. There was just some messages, but like I was barely there. And there was so many other people involved in that story that I will never meet. I don't know who they are. And me and him will still occasionally like text sometimes and just say, how are you? But we still have only met 3 times. People will notice that there's something different about you and ask questions themselves. And if they don't, then that's okay, because it's not your job to save the whole world. Maybe you'll be someone that they look back on when they start asking somebody else questions. So, summing up, to finish up, how would I summarise what I've said today, or what would I say are the main takeaways? How do we be disciples? So the first one, in following Jesus, I would say the most important thing is act with love and compassion for people regardless of who they are. Again, I was looking up stuff about this, and 1 Corinthians 13:13 says, so now faith, hope, and love abide, these 3, but the greatest of these is love. And the greatest of these is love. So act with love and compassion for people regardless of who they are, and regardless of whether you agree with how they are living their lives. The second one for evangelism is that you don't have to desperately preach the gospel with every breath that you take. Your actions can speak for themselves, and God has to be involved. So yeah, if I was to sum everything up I just said, it would be in those 2 things. That is all I've got to say today. Hopefully something was, you could take something away from that. And I am assuming that at this point I invite the worship team up, but I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing from this point forth.